Kia ora koutou. I might just get us started nice and early so we can utilize the whole hour. So I'm AJ, one of your conveners for this seminar series. And before I introduce our speaker, I'm just going to hand it over to Hana to introduce us with karakia.
I'd like to start from karakia. Whakataka te hao ki te uru, whakataka te hao ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura. He tio, he huka, he hohu. Ti hei, Māori ora.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you everyone for coming. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Senior Social Scientist Dr. Sally Potter, who will be talking with us about ethics in hazard warning and response. Dr. Potter was part of the GNS geohazard response team before setting up her own consultancy, Canary Innovation, last year. Her talk will draw on 14 years of experience in supporting physical scientists and field technicians in taking an ethical approach to communication, ensuring all public communications leading up to and in response to an event conducted ethically, and following ethical practices in hazardous event-related research. Today, she'll share some insight into how the social science team assisted the wider scientific research to events like the 2018 and Canterbury and 2016 Kaikoura earthquakes, 2012 Tongariro and 2019 Whakaari eruptions, the 2022-23 Taupo unrest, and the 2023 Cyclone Gabrielle landslides. So big topic with lots to address. So I'll hand it over to Sally.
Great, thank you very much, and kia ora koutou. Thanks very much for having me along to talk about this today. Just going to bring up the slides. Okay, so yes, as AJ said, I'm going to be talking today on some of my experiences throughout the last 15 years in our social science research and operational practices in supporting the physical scientists and conducting our own work through these kind of hazardous events. So a little bit of an overview about me to give some context for where this is all coming from. I was raised in Taupo and I moved there in time to see the eruption of 95, 96 at Ruapehu. That's me on the right there with my cousin.
Sorry, Sally, we just can't see your slides. Could you try sharing them again? Yeah.
Okay, I shall try. Can you see either of my screens?
Yes, we can see, yep, a desktop with a lovely sort of lamp and screen.
Not the right screen. All right, I'll put it there.
Yes, now we can see your PowerPoint, but not the slideshow version. Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect.
All right, thank you.
Carry on.
Okay, yes, so grew up in Taupo, saw the eruption, felt the earthquakes in Taupo from the late 90s and early 2000s. Which turned out to be Taupo unrest. And from there, I did a Bachelor of Science in Geology at Victoria University. So it really started out in this physical geology kind of space, and then on to an honours degree in volcanology at Massey University, Palmerston North. I then spent a few years at Environment Waikato doing a hydro-technician kind of role and a little bit of emergency management there before going back to Massey and doing my PhD. And I'll talk a little bit more about my PhD soon and some of the ethical things from that. Then I spent the next about 10 years at GNS doing social science research and operational application to do with warnings, anything to do with warnings. So the communication of forecasts for geohazards, as well as impact-based warnings with Met Service on weather warnings, and so on there. And then last year I left GNS and I set up my own company called Canary Innovation, where I do consultancy and research for clients and as well as endeavour programs. And so I'll finish with a little bit of a reflection on some of those aspects there. Now, I looked up what the definition of geoethics is, and you can see that this is the one that I found, and it is got three main aspects there, and it kind of does ground my talk quite well, I think. The first is that geoethics consists of research and reflection on the values which underpin appropriate behaviours and practices. So this really drives a lot of the work that I do, and that I think a lot of we do as geoscientists. And that is making sure that the approach that we take in our research, in our operations, is as ethical as we can in terms of being really open and honest about our knowledge and our monitoring data and our everything that we do basically, and that we treat everybody with respect. And that's reflected in number 2 as well. So geoethics deals with the ethical, social, and cultural implications of geoscience knowledge, research, practice, education, and communication, and with the social role and responsibility of geoscientists. So again, this is making sure that, as often what's seen as government employees being geoscientists and sort of the official source of information at GNS, but also for university scientists who are helping during event response. And we really do have that role and responsibility to be open and honest and trustworthy and respectful with everything that we do. And then the third aspect there is that geoethics encourages geoscientists and wider society to become fully aware of the humankind's role as an active geological force on the planet. Now, I've had less to do with this side of things, I have to admit, but I will include a little bit on that towards the end. So for my PhD research, I was trying to figure out at what point do you change the volcanic alert level at a caldera volcano such as Taupo from 0 or no unrest up to 1 minor unrest. Now that sounds quite easy in principle, but what it needs is you have to have a really good understanding of what activity it's happened in the background. So that was a historical chronology, which meant diving into old newspapers to find out what observations had occurred about earthquakes in the area and ground movement and any kind of geothermal activity. And I developed a volcanic unrest index to rate those. Now, both of those aspects did not really involve much at all interaction with people, so there was less of an ethical side of things there. But the third part was reviewing New Zealand's volcanic alert level system. Now that involved, I used an ethnographic methodology. So this is where a social scientist is in amongst a culture or a community and looking at the way they interact with a certain thing. And in this case, it was the volcanic alert level system. And I was integrated in with the volcanologists at GNS Science for 3 years. So during that, I did a lot of observations of how they use the alert level system, and also a lot of interviews with them and with emergency managers and other volcanologists around New Zealand to try and understand what do we need in a volcanic alert level system, as well as some document analysis. Now, something that I found here was that I was observing these scientists in what could be quite a stressful situation and taking notes and reflections. And it wasn't really, to be honest, until quite a few years later when I approached an emergency management group to ask whether I could do some observations of them to see how they used scientific information about geohazards in their response decision making, and they declined. And the reason for this was because ethically it could risk their reputation. If they received a piece of scientific advice and they choose to ignore it for some reason, like any reason, then things go horribly south from there, then they can really be at risk from liability and so on. Like a lot of different risks are involved in that. And so I think that really highlights that whether you're wanting to do sort of technical observation as a social scientist, or if you just want to be and just go and observe, people for some other reason, you really have to be quite careful ethically about how you do this and getting the appropriate ethical permission to do this and follow really good processes so that you can try and avoid all of those potential risks on those people. Now, during my PhD, we had 2 eruptions at Tongariro. So as I said, I was observing the scientists during this. So I'll just delve into this a little bit so I can share about what I learned there. In July 2012, there were 3 swarms of earthquakes, each lasting between 1 to 4 days, just under the Tamari vent area. And then the earthquake suddenly stopped. Our scientists went out and recorded some magmatic gas, which indicated that there were some volcanic processes going on, and we raised the alert level on the 20th of July. Now, at that point, we went out to one of the local marae, and we shared this information with them. And at times, that was quite a tense hui. And it really showed that respect for two-way communication, I think, and from our very senior scientists at the time in the volcanology department there, going out and meeting these leaders and other members of the community there to share that information, as well as all those uncertainties. Because at that point, of course, we didn't know it was going to erupt, or if it would or not, but we went out and did it anyway. And so I think that really highlighted for me that value of the open communication, even in tricky situations there. And then, of course, it ended up erupting 6th of August 2012, so a couple of weeks later, and again on the 21st of November. Now, that's one of those ethical geoethics definitions, right, is that social responsibility of geoscientists to go out and communicate, acknowledge those uncertainties. And also, we worked on how to more consistently communicate across our different agencies, whether it was with GNS Science and the emergency managers, Department of Conservation. There was a couple of different councils involved at Ruapehu as well. And this is where we first, well, not first, but really kicked off our development of volcanic hazard maps. I've got the example on the left there, and you can see it's called the Tamari Eruption Phenomena Map. Now, this was not a hazard map because the locals there did not like the word hazard. It's only a hazard if you put yourself in the way of it. So we called it a phenomena map. And that's another example of taking an ethical and open approach and listening to feedback there. The next thing that this eruption really kicked off was some reflection internally at GNS on the ethical side of things of putting our volcano monitoring staff in dangerous situations to take monitoring observations and collect data. So this is where our forecasting of eruptions and taking a risk calculation approach to health and safety really kicked off. Now, the earthquakes, so they started in 2010, so this is jumping back a bit, but then we had a whole series of them over the time that I was working at GNS there. From the 2013 magnitude 6.5 Cook Strait earthquakes and magnitude 6.6 Lake Grasmere, and then 2016 we had the magnitude 7.8 Kaikoura earthquake. Now, Julia Becker led the social science research following those 2010 Canterbury earthquakes onto how best to communicate earthquake information. So whether that's the forecasts or just general, expect aftershock type information and so on. How should we as geoscientists position that kind of information amongst all the other information out there that's going to people that have been impacted? So that research showed us how we should improve the way we communicate. And with each of those subsequent earthquakes, we then improved the way that we actually in practice applied this and communicated those forecasts and information more effectively. This helped us really understand the user needs of this type of geoscience information. So how does an emergency manager want their information compared to someone from infrastructure and local and central government and so on. Something else that these earthquakes really highlighted to us was that when our physical scientists, our field technicians, are going out into the field, like might be to a farm that's been heavily impacted in a rural area somewhere to look for landslides or to measure offset of the earthquake fault, etc. Those scientists might be the first official people that that family has seen so far in the event. They might not know anything about what's going on because all their telecommunications have been cut, etc. So it showed to us that ethically, instead of just turning up on these farms and taking information away, we really had to come with information to give to those people to help them as well. So we prepared an overview kind of fact sheet of what had happened with that event, just saying the magnitude and the location of the earthquake, any aftershock information, and what to expect next, i.e. more earthquakes. And also a whole list of sort of psychosocial support phone numbers, or how they can get help, welfare help as well. So our field technicians could just give that to them as they arrived, and kind of gave them some advice on how to help those people as well in person. But keeping in mind that field technician is also not trained to be any kind of counsellor. So yeah, we supported those technicians as we could there, and continued to do that through further events. Then we had Cyclone Gabrielle in 2017, and the town of Edgecombe flooded. Now, during right after this event, GNS social scientists, again led by Julia Becker, alongside NIWA risk scientists, went to the houses that had been flooded during this event to take impact measurements. This was an example of how we could help those physical and risk scientists to take an ethical approach in their work as well, making sure they'd done a risk ethics process through the university or through internal processes as required. And again, just being really sensitive to people's experiences when we're talking to them about that flood, because it's potentially a traumatic event for those people. In 2019, we had the Whakaari eruption, of course, very tragic one, on the 9th of December. Now, this brings me to volcano monitoring and the role that the social scientists have had in that. So we would attend the weekly volcano monitoring meetings and would have input into those communications that come out of that, such as the volcanic activity bulletins, website articles, video scripts, and fact sheets. Would also help give external advice on social science matters. But really, the underpinning approach that we would take, as well as to the wording of communications, was really advocating for an open and honest communication channel, so that we could be as transparent as possible and help build trust. And I think that really comes down to that ethics and that social responsibility of scientists, especially in government agencies. So with this eruption in December 2019, we really thought we had to have this empathetic messaging right at the front of all the volcanic activity bulletins that came out. So it didn't just come out as, what might seem like to some a really cold science bulletin. It really acknowledges that human impact as well. So we made sure we carried on doing that for the bulletins for quite some time. Then in 2022, we had the Tonga eruption, 15th of January. Now, this really exemplifies when we started to do crowdsourcing for observations to inform things like where impacts might be greatest, where the hotspots are, how to prioritize field work, and so on. So in this particular event, we heard observations that there was a tsunami activity around New Zealand, and also a booming noise heard right across New Zealand. So 6 days after the event, we did a survey. Now, this is low risk ethics because the impacts were low and the event had already occurred. It had been and gone. What we've been trying to do is set up a crowdsourcing survey that can be a bit more live and dynamic, and people can just put their observations on all the time, whether they've gone for a walk on the Tongariro Alpine Crossing or they're visiting a geothermal area in Rotorua, and they can just put in their pictures, whether it's just a sort of normal business as usual activity or something a bit more extreme. Now, there are a lot of ethical issues with this kind of survey, which we very much came across. And Sarah Harrison ended up leading a whole ethics project on this alone. Because some of the challenges are that you obviously don't want to put people in harm's way. So if this was a live event, you don't want to be saying, give us all your observations of a tsunami event, and they all run down to the coast and take photos. We can't have that. So as I said, this particular one was all right because it was 6 days later and we weren't putting in people in harm's way. Another ethical challenge with these type of surveys is ensuring the privacy of people and property, especially in any photos. If people took a photo of their neighbour's property with a big landslide coming through it, and it showed their letterbox number, for example, then that becomes identifiable about and it could then go on and impact their insurance and their property values and that sort of thing. Also, any photos of people and faces and that kind of thing. So it becomes problematic quite quickly. But then conversely, you've got other people who expressly want to be identified because they've contributed their information. You know, they want to be acknowledged for that. And an example is this image on the right here, which was one of the tsunami observations seen from that Tonga eruption event of a campsite that got flooded down in Canterbury. And the person really wanted their name to be said. So you've got to try and have a survey question that specifically says, do you want to be identified or not? Then we've got the accessibility of that information. So if we're collecting all this information in, it's obviously got a lot of value for emergency managers and others if you can do it in a live way. So you want to be able to share that quite quickly, but then those, if you share it really quickly and you haven't been able to vet the data, then you could be, you know, putting out some sort of image that other people should not be seeing. And that could be especially in the case if there were really severe impacts and you started getting injuries and that kind of thing on there. So that's a whole thing in itself. So then you can have different layers. You can have sign-in. If you register as a certain level, you know, you can access this data, but not if you're just the general public and so on. There's just so many layers with this crowdsourcing survey that I had difficulties to try and progress. So with this particular survey, we tried to turn the data around as quickly as we could and make it accessible in a meaningful way. So one of my colleagues, Rachel Lawson at GNS, put together this story map to make it as accessible as possible. And you can find that on the GNS website. And here's another part of that same survey, but this is about the volcano boom sound. And you can see this has been published and led by Marianne Clive. And one of the examples on the right there is showing the timing of that boom wave as it crossed New Zealand. So it's really cool. And you should check out that paper if you can. Now, these are some of the questions relating to the boom. And you can see there, one of the questions is to do with the person's location. And this just highlights that there's this real value in knowing exactly where an observation was taken. So, for example, if it's to do with tsunami inundation, then you want to know exactly where that is so that you can map the inundation. But for people's privacy, what you need to be able to do is aggregate that data. And that can mean that that location hops like 10 kilometers inland or something like that, which makes that data completely worthless when it comes to trying to map any kind of inundation. So that's another real challenge with the ethics and privacy of this kind of data to do with that spatial, like the location and how specific you can be for this. And again, who can access that data. Then in 2022 to 23, we had Taupo unrest. So again, this was like my PhD coming to life. We changed the alert level up to 1. But part of this was this earthquake that occurred, and you can see the felt reports from GeoNet as an example of crowdsourcing reports that have gone on for a very long time. But we quickly launched a multi-hazard crowdsourcing survey. So this was a volcano-induced earthquake, which induced tsunami and landslides, which was pretty darn cool. So we collected these records of what people observed around the lake, which helped inform where we should go to do field work. But one of the challenges with this as well is if you ask what impacts occurred, this can get you up into the high-risk ethics and it can be quite problematic. And so for now, what we've been doing is just leaving open comment boxes for things like, if you've got anything else you want to tell us about, you know, and then sometimes they'll put in, oh yes, and my, you know, well, chimney cracked or something fell off the shelf and that kind of thing. And you can start to sort of get a feel for impacts, but without it being a very robust methodology just yet. Now, at the moment, we're conducting a study through the Horetiriti Whenua Sliding Lands Endeavour program, which is looking at user needs for landslide forecasts that were issued by GNS Science during Cyclone Gabrielle in 2023. Now, obviously, this was a highly impactful event, and some of the people we're talking to, such as emergency managers and infrastructure, they were involved during this event, and they even might have received this forecast at the time. So when we're going and interviewing them now, we got high-risk ethics to really make sure that our processes were robust and that we aren't causing those people any more harm than what they've already been through. So we were very careful with that, but it's an example of how, as well as geoscientists, we want to make sure our forecast information is as meaningful as possible and giving people what they need at the right time and in the right way. And then finally, now that I'm a consultant and doing research, I found that this world is quite different to the research world and operational as well. When I went to Cambodia and Laos this year to conduct some evaluation of a development project to do with a flood warning system, I think it's great that they're doing evaluation. That's a really ethical thing to do. But also they felt there was no need for human ethics when going in and doing focus groups and interviews. So this is something I'm kind of grappling with in the consultancy world at the moment, but I think either way, I'll continue to make sure I'm doing an ethical process as I go to keep, you know, to make sure there's no harm coming to these people. But again, everyone I talked to is really keen to be involved and identified in all sorts of things. And just to finish with, this is a photo that I took in Alice in Italy, the Centre for Scientific Culture, which was founded in 1962 by an Italian physicist to promote advanced research and dialogue across scientific disciplines. And I think that's a pretty cool thing to do. And I went there for the Volcano Observatory Best Practice meeting in 2013. But I think it also highlights that geoethics definition number 3 about how we need to be aware of our role as an active geological force on the planet and traveling to these kind of events and the impact that that has on the climate. I think it's really tricky when we live in New Zealand and the only way we can really be part of these kind of conversations is when we fly to them. You know, I know a lot of the European colleagues can take trains and that kind of thing, or even attend online because they're in the right time zone. But I found that with a lot of experience with international work, it's very difficult for New Zealanders to join online when it's in the middle of the night. So that's something I'm still grappling with from an ethical point of view, limiting it where I can. But yeah, it's something for discussion anyway. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to attempt to ask questions and discuss further.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sally. Anyone want to start us off with questions? Cool. I'll start us off, I guess. I was really curious with one of the last things you said there about, I don't think I quite caught what country it was in, but the flood management said they thought there wasn't a need for social science to come in. I guess my main question is, can you just speak to that a bit more? But I think as a specific question, is that more these communities don't necessarily want to be like written about from an outsider perspective, or is it more they feel like those roles are being met in other ways?
Yeah, no, it's not that they don't want social scientists to come in, it's that they didn't think that there was a need for following ethical processes and those kind of, you know, short-term consultancy type roles. Yeah, that's more. The communities that I talked to, it was in Cambodia, they were very keen to be heard and, yeah, have their thoughts recorded.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Hello, I have one question. Hello, I'm Hannah. Is there anything you consider when communicating about scientific uncertainty?
Yes, I have a lot to say on uncertainty. I think in a nutshell, what I have found is that most of the stakeholders and a good chunk of the public are really keen to hear the information, whether it's uncertain or not, and to hear what that uncertainty is. And they've got a pretty good understanding actually of probabilities. So I've always advocated for telling people, even if things are highly uncertain, for sure. And just being really clear on that uncertainty if you can as well. Like, for example, when you give a eruption probability, you can give it in a range, you know, so it might be a 5% probability in a certain amount of time. So then you can say, well, actually it's a 3 to 8% chance, or, you know, the models, and especially for earthquake forecasting, tend to have those numbers. So yeah, that went down quite well.
Cool. We have one in the chat from Andrew. Two in the chat. I'll ask the first one, both from Andrew. First one about the use of the word phenomena instead of hazards, that example. This question is, was the feedback for the use of the word hazard considered a misrepresentation for a landmark that was significant to
them? I don't think it was related to a landmark from my memory. It's more just the word hazard in general. So that's why we changed it to phenomena, to be, you know, it's related to things like laha or pyroclastic density currents and that side of things. Yeah, so it's kind of like a common way that we changed all our maps from then on for the different volcanoes.
Follow up, which you sort of answered there, but from that, what considerations have you learned, and what would you recommend to become more considerate of those sort of creating labels for those sorts of maps and reflections?
Yeah, I think that shows, I mean, particularly in New Zealand, there are a lot of Māori communities around the volcanoes that have special relationships with those volcanoes and the various landmarks. And so it's an ethical way that I think we all know about in our country, at least, to respect that and to ensure that we're you know, spelling things appropriately and calling them appropriate names and so on. So I think New Zealand is really quite good at that compared to other countries around the world from what I've seen as well.
Well, we've got two hands, so Kath first.
Thank you, and my apologies. I spent ages going round and round in circles trying to open up this Zoom link, but so I kind of missed quite a bit of your introductory stuff. I'm up on the east coast of the Coromandel, and whilst we were in the sort of immediate aftermath of Cyclone Gabrielle and prior to that Cyclone Hale, I was in correspondence or discussion with the regional council, which had asked to be told of any land slumping, and we had a very considerable slump. And when I did talk to them, they said, "Oh, we don't." I said, "Oh, there's been a chopper go across. What's that one doing?" And they said, "Oh, it's GNS. They're looking at the landslides and cracks and things." I never found out where to go within GNS or how you got to look at the data or who would be gatekeeping it and whether it would cost a individual landowner to see it. Can you tell me about that? Because in the sense that access to information about your own coastal property is significant to us. We had about 120-meter slump with a whole lot of large trees just sort of surfing down onto the rocks.
Wow.
But I'm really curious to know how ordinary people get to see the data.
Sure, I can have an attempt at an answer, not being at GNS anymore or ESNZ, but my understanding is that there's a national landslide database, and I'm just not sure if it's actively available yet or if it's still within GNS. But I believe if you do email the Earth Sciences New Zealand contact details, are you still there?
Yep.
Oh, yep. Sorry, just sped off my screen.
I think the system just turned. Put my hand down, so
you should be able to get that data, but also the regional council may have it as well. Like they often get that data during an emergency response from GNS to inform their response as well, either the local or the regional council. So that's another avenue you could try.
The regional council told me to go to GNS.
Okay.
But,
yeah. I would suggest following that up with the landslide scientists there, because they've got a lot of information and data that could be available.
Yeah. Maybe there's somebody on the call who can give us more information.
Oh, there you go. Anne-Marie's put it in the chat. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Okay, thank you.
We've got a hand from Nabila.
Kaikoura. Thanks, Sally. That was a really good presentation. I picked up on one of the things that you mentioned sort of towards the end of your presentation around just the decisions that geoscientists negotiate with in terms of international air travel and the ethics of that. And I guess slightly relatedly, I was curious about how you've seen the ethical implications of whether it's emergency managers or other sort of workers that do response work for public information and their use of generative AI, given that that is something that has obvious impact on the climate, then you're also responding to sort of disasters that are a result of climate change. Yeah, just curious about your thoughts on that.
So on the use of AI.
Yes.
And
yeah, generative AI specifically, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. I guess you would just have to make that decision in terms of a cost benefit, which is really difficult when you're talking global costs versus your local population that's currently getting impacted or whatever. If that kind of information could help save lives, then is that more value than, a little portion of climate warming? It's a very difficult one, I think, and could be a global debate, I think, on that kind of on topic going forward.
Any more questions? I will just note for Kath and anyone else just following the Geoscience message, these are recorded and will eventually be uploaded to YouTube. So if anyone's interested in catching up on the last two or missed a section of this one, should be up there, and the links in the chat should be up there soon.
Thank you so much.
All good. Have we got any final questions? Feel free to just unmute yourselves and jump in.
Sally, I very much enjoyed your talk. It's been like a bit going down memory lane. So, what's your kind of biggest learnings from all these, years of experience? Is there any particular recommendation that you can make to physical scientists like me?
You've been a key part of all of this, Emery. For me, the real driver is making sure we communicate our information and don't hold on to it. That to me is the ethical thing to do. And I see it time and time again, and not just in science, but wider than that. There's this idea that we'll create forecasts and then we'll only share it with some people, or just not even share it, use it only for internal purposes. And to me, that's the fundamental antithesis of an ethical approach. So I would just really want to see that any geoscience information that we come up with appropriately shared, and I mean appropriate in terms of it has that contextual information with it and the uncertainties, and it has that background, metadata or whatever it needs to go with it for it to make sense, but that it's shared and ideally in an accessible way in terms of not behind paywalls and not too complex and technical and that side of things.
Echo that. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Sally. I think we'll wrap it there. So yeah, really appreciate it. And I will just echo that this talk will be available on the GSNZ YouTube. And if you're interested in our next seminar, we'll be hosting Julia Martin from Girls on Ice, where on September 30th, where we'll be talking about empowering young women and gender diverse people in geoscience through fieldwork on the ice. So now, just lastly, I'll hand over to Hannah to close us with a karakia.
Unahia ki te uru tapanui. Kia wātea, kia māma, te nāko, te tinana. Te wairua I te ara takata. Koe la e rongo, whakairia ake ki ronga. Kia tina, tina, huie, tākie.
Thanks everyone for coming. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.